from are what we would call present images in order to document crimes and to create future archives. So as our director, Eyal Weizman, writes, as the evolving information and media environment enables authoritarian states to manipulate and distort facts about their crimes, it also offers new techniques with which civil society groups can invert the forensic gaze and monitor them. So this is what we could frame as the counter-forensic approach that we employ. In this way, we operate in various contexts, and worldwide there's this map of our interventions. So, this is a video. Does it play? Okay, yeah. And we use a diverse array of architectural tools, but also other interdisciplinary methodologies such as sound analysis, remote sensing, documentary, film, and other practices. So we are now a team of more than 20 practitioners from various disciplines, including journalists, architects, filmmakers, software developers, and other expertise. So, and our investigators include the field of land rights, environmental violence, heritage, police violence very often, and as well as violence exercised by contemporary borders against migrants and refugees, which will be also the focus of my talk today. So the specific lens through which I will talk about our border project is the way we access, read, interpret, translate, navigate, and present images in relation to the case we are investigating. So in that sense, image, I'm not talking about image only as a still image, but also as it may be a collection of images, it may be moving image, video, CCTV footage, but also images from other perspectives like a satellite image. More specifically, one area of interest around which we have been developing an extensive research project over the past 2 years now is the Evros Meritz River. While the context of this project diverts from the urban environment in which often we operate, it also opens new realms of possibilities which are urgent in order to rethink new modes of engagement with current affairs that require a more rigorous attention to elements that exceed the immediate environment of the city. So one recently published case of this project with which I will depart my talk is the killing of Muhammad Gulzar. This was a large collaborative project that was in partnership with Bellingcat, which is an open source investigative agency, Lighthouse Reports, another group of open source investigators and journalists, as well as with additional research from the German Der Spiegel, the Dutch Pointer, and other media. This investigation is part of the project that we have developed on the Evros Meritz River, as I mentioned, which we see here on the map. It's a river that spans from the trilateral border with Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey on the north until the Aegean Sea on the south. The stretch of the river that is delineated here in yellow is the official land border, as it is called, between Turkey and Greece, and is often characterized as a natural border. So this part of the river has been extensively militarized in the last decade, as have been many border zones of the European Union, and has been incorporated into a broader ecosystem of border defense. At the same time, it constitutes a very tense landscape due to elongated tension between histories of contestation between the two states, Greece and Turkey. And the border was defined as following the median line of the river, but as the river cannot be a fixed boundary, but rather expands and detracts, so this has been causing further tension as to what is the actual delineation of the river, of the border. This is a video, sorry. Hello? Okay. This is a video. Hello? Hi? Hello? Sorry, the previous slide. This is a video. Okay. Can we play the video? No? Okay. Okay. Well, now it's a bit... so go to the previous because this doesn't show anything. Okay. So there is one region where the border has always run over land, and this is the so-called Karagats Triangle, which we don't really see well here, but it's that triangle that is delineated between the river, which is in blue, and the yellow line, which is the actual border. So this is the only part where the border actually runs over land and is not delineated from the river. So this area is marked by a 11-kilometer long fence erected in 2012 as a so-called technical obstacle, cutting across agricultural land and stretching from the river to the official crossing point between Greece and Turkey. Okay. So this area is of particular interest for the first part of today's talk, but the erection of the fence here is also crucial for another reason, because it has further weaponized the river, forcing the diversion of migrant trajectories into more dangerous routes, which means the actual river itself, but also the Aegean Sea. Is there any way to play any video with this? Okay. Okay, I see. Okay. So, next. So this area, the Castagnes-Pazarcule border crossing, was one of the main points where in late February, thousands of migrants were funneled by Turkey with the promise of an upper border. So what essentially happened, this is usually a very closely militarized border, but they were driven there, a lot of people, thousands of people, because they were told that they can continue the trajectory or apply for asylum in Greece. So they were weaponized in an attempt by Turkey to exert political pressure on the European Union. And here we see one of the first images that were circulated that day, with people gathering on the first fenced part behind the Turkish border crossing station. The Greek government responded by deploying extensive police and military forces in this already militarized border, and they warned migrants not to cross and suspended the asylum system for a month. And after several days of tension, on March 4th of 2020, of course we're talking, violence escalated at that specific point, border crossing, and there were reports of shootings and casualties. And this was 2 days after reports had already emerged of the killing of a young Syrian man, Mohammed Al-Arab, on the 2nd of March on another part of the river, for which we as forensic architecture had released a preliminary study in order to verify the incident. So the Greek authorities, this is the Greek government spokesperson, Stelios Petsas, they immediately denounced both of these claims as fake news, and the two states embarked into dangerous routes of disinformation, denialism, and propaganda from both sides. This is also a video. No, it's okay. Okay, yeah, it's okay. So in order to understand what happened that day, we set out to reconstruct the event to the best of our knowledge. So there were several research questions that were asked, including were shots fired that day, and if yes, was this live ammunition? And can we assert from which side of the border these shots were fired? And were people injured and was someone indeed killed that morning. So the collective intelligence of all the team members, as well as external sources such as journalists on the ground and witness testimonies, were crucial in our efforts in unfolding the incident. The first step in that, as often happens with such investigations, is trying to gather as much material as possible. So, as the last decades have seen a proliferation and dissemination of media and phone footage in what has become a sort of collective witnessing, often providing multiple perspectives that can be reassembled towards the process of verification. So in this case, we were able to gather more than 100 images and videos of that morning of March 4th through open source investigation, especially in social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook, where such media usually circulate live during instances of violence. Bellingcat, one of our there are many videos, there's much more material that I'm sorry you don't see anything, but it's okay. So Bellingcat, one of our collaborators, have compiled a very useful report that provides more information on this process as well as other aspects of our work. So in order to start working closely with the material, we need to have a selection of this for closer analysis in order to be able to chronolocate them, meaning place them in time, and also geolocate them. So many times we do into reading an image involves extracting the metadata from it. So it is the simplest way in trying to understand the meta information of the image, meaning when, where, and how it was shot. However, most of the social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and message platforms such as WhatsApp immediately delete any metadata. So uploads or sends that photo, this information is not available anymore. So for us in this case, we had an anchor to start with, because several of these videos were live streamed on Facebook, so therefore we had a clear timestamp of some of the videos. So also another interesting part of this was that depending on which side of the border the videos were taken, these videos and photographs were often time-coded differently. So even if we're talking about a 10-meter difference, then there was a time zone for which we had to account for. So specific indicators, which we cannot see here, but so specific events such as burst of gunfire acted as temporal indicators that helped us synchronize the videos and create a continuous timeline of events. So also in order to precisely geolocate the videos, we sourced high-resolution satellite imagery from March 2020, which captures the state of the vegetation along the border fence as we see here. Because also it was in March, so we needed to have precise information about the color of the fields, about the state of the vegetation in order to understand where its video is taken. Unfortunately, you cannot see the model, but so having these landmarks and other vegetational elements as reference, it helped us determine the location of the videos and place them within a 3D model. So in our work, these digital but also physical models are more than mere 3D-dimensional containers. They function as analytical and navigational devices. So something that we call operative models. So by triangulating, correlating, and placing the various media and images within our model, it allows us to develop a multi-perspectival view in our understanding of the events. So the more videos and images are within the model, the more precise our understanding of the event becomes. So in that sense, image, space, and time become entangled in a loophole, because the moving or the still image informs the model, and the model informs the event, or better, our understanding of the event. So by repeating this process of the 3D model with the remaining videos, we were able to reconstruct the scene, and we were able to trace the trajectory of 7 people who appeared to have been wounded. So we identified the 7 people based on clothing, injuries, and blankets. as well as some improvised stretchers that were used to evacuate them. So we tracked each person from the air, so each color represents a different person that was injured. We tracked each person from the area of the fence, where they appear to have been wounded, to the Turkish border crossing station, which is, sorry, I can use this now, which is in the north, where they were evacuated from ambulances. So we see the direction of the people, and these circles denote the videos. So the pattern of these trajectories on the map indicates not only the direction, but also we can understand that there may have been two different centers of concentrated areas of shooting. So at a certain point throughout its process, and by carefully examining all these images, we were able to identify the person who had already been reported killed, Muhammad Gulzar. And this was done by comparing as well distinctive elements. I'm not showing you any images here because they're also quite graphic, and I think it's better if anyone watches them at their own time. We also obtained some photos from the widow of Gulzar, Saba Khan, who was with him at the border crossing and during the time he was killed. So Muhammad was originally from Pakistan, and he had previously lived in Athens. He was actually associated with City Plaza, that there is also here. And he was at the border with Saba Khan, hoping to enter Greece again. So here we have a small recording of Saba, but we cannot hear it. So I will continue. So we obtained also some hospital documents and death certificates that indicate that Muhammad was declared dead at 11:45 that morning, and that the cause of death was injuries caused by a 5.56 millimeter bullet. So once we had verified that indeed several people were injured and Muhammad was killed at the border, we set out to establish whether live ammunition had been used and whether they could correspond to the 5.56 millimeter bullets what we see. So these two videos, they were shot from opposite sides of the border. The one on the right is from the Greek side, and the one on the left is from the Turkish side. And they were shot approximately 25 minutes after Gulzar was shot, and they capture the same bursts of gunfire. We don't see them here. We would need to hear them actually, but I don't think so. So there is a sequence anyway of one more. I'm sorry, it's just that they are all videos, so it's very hard to understand what I'm talking about. But so there's a sequence in those videos. I will just go through them quickly because it's much more difficult to understand if there's a sequence in those two videos of several shots that correspond, so we were able to synchronize those videos. And then we asked the forensic expert, Steve Beck, audio forensics expert, to analyze these audible bursts of gunfire and to determine whether he could determine whether what we hear through those videos is live ammunition. So he determined that the recording indeed registered the clear signature of live fire, because there are two distinct sounds, the crack and the muzzle blast, that this bullet produces when it's shot. So since a supersonic bullet such as a 5.56 millimeter travels faster than the speed of sound, the first thing heard by a person in the line of fire is a crack caused by the shock wave of the bullet, followed by the bang of a muzzle blast. So we actually see for the spectrogram better here, we can imagine the sound. He also inferred that the time intervals between the different shots correspond to with a rhythm typical of a semi-automatic firearm. And that this was a very important finding as well. He inferred that the time gap between the two distinct sounds indicates that the shooter were within 40 to 60 meters from the camera, because the further away from the camera a supersonic bullet is is fired, the larger the gap between the sound of the crack and the muzzle blast that I talked about before. So since we had already geolocated that camera, we could see the radius of 40 to 60 meters within which Greek soldiers could be seen in the footage. So, and while the video was filmed around 25 minutes after Gülzar was shot, it provided useful to understand the sound signatures of the shots. And in this case, this particular video was analyzed not only for its visual elements, but also for the information that the sound entailed. And you can go over it, the investigation online, and see the specific part and hear the sounds. So that translation from sound to space and vice versa was very important in understanding and interpreting the image itself. So since we established that live ammunition was fired, the last step was to examine the available footage for personnel carrying rifles compatible with a 5.56mm bullet. So those such weapons are common to both Turkish and Greek militaries. We were unable to find Turkish personnel carrying such weapons near the fence on that day, outside the immediate vicinity of the Turkish border crossing station that we knew already border guards were stationed. On the other hand, several photos and videos capture Greek soldiers armed with rifles capable of fire 5.56mm bullets along the border first, shortly before, after, during and after the shooting. So here, these blue lines that we could not see before, these are actually the shots that we can hear from the videos, and that helped us synchronize the footage. And this is the interval in which we see Greek soldiers armed with 5.56mm bullet firearms. So through attempting to respond to our research questions and based on all the available evidence in our disposal, we inferred that it is highly probable that the shots were indeed fired from the Greek side of the border. So at the aftermath of the video, backlash came, as was expected, of course, from the Greek government, with officials denouncing once again the investigation as fake news and Turkish propaganda. This came along targeting of researchers, journalists, and people advocating for accountability for those days, and generally for the border violence exerted against migrants on the Greek and Turkish border. And there was a very big campaign of targeting those people, and by Greek public members repeating the Turkish propaganda statements, which is also indicative of the elongated tension around national sovereignty and nationalistic pride that characterizes both states, in which migrants in that case were really caught in a stalemate between. So it seems that this right-wing insurgency against efforts to collective truth-making forms part of what Eyal calls an assertion of an ideological construction by which politicians try to compel somebody to believe and act regardless of evidence, and sometimes despite evidence. However, what we saw also after the investigation and other, of course, calls by many other human rights groups was also a renewed attempt towards accountability by the wider public and by political actors. And some days after the publication, over 100 MEPs signed a letter calling the European Commission to launch an independent investigation into the events of March. So in this context, there was a public hearing on the 6th of July at the European Parliament, where spokespersons of the Greek government were requested to respond to the findings of the events of March 2020. And while the response that came was an ambiguous clatter of denial as well, it was an important first step towards public mobilization for accountability, which of course needs to be safeguarded much more than some broken promises that the European Commission often offers. So this investigation of the killing of Muhammed Gülzar was completed in the context of a larger project that we have been developing, as I mentioned in the beginning, in collaboration with a Greek legal NGO, Human Rights 360, on illegitimate practices of pushbacks and violence at that specific river border that Tatiana also mentioned before. So on that project, generally, the privilege of working on a very well-documented case through cell phone footage, through this form of collective witnessing, has not been the case. So the events of March were facilitating within this larger context of extensive violence, militarization, and illegitimate practices. And this network of practices comprises of well-established infrastructure at the border area of detention centers, obscure involvement of police and military or paramilitary actors, as well as obscure facilities. So pushbacks are a systematic and organized operation, usually convened by masked men and armed men, and constitutes the illegal and often forceful return of migrants across the border without the possibility for them to apply for asylum. Although pushback operations have been known and reported by that specific border area between Greece and Turkey have been reported by migrants and human rights groups for more than a decade now. And although they contravene a series of European, national, and international law, the Greek and the European Union authorities as well have been systematically denying any wrongdoing, which is, of course, something to be expected, and refusing to investigate even these reports. And to a further extent, as we see lately, to criminalize also people researching these reports. So this has also to do with the difficulty of capturing those operations, because pushbacks at Evros happen concealed with no means for the migrants to document what is happening, because it is part of the surveillance regime. There is the control of the images and the circulation of the images. So witnesses describe having their phones, documents, and belongings confiscated and often thrown into the river, suggesting an operation carefully designed to obscure all possible evidence of human rights violations. So an interesting question that arises through this project, and of course other projects that have similar limitation, is how we document violations when these are not filmed, cannot be filmed, or due to access or other reasons, as we see here. So when we have usually such an abundance of media to work with, which is crucial every day, and we see that with police violence, we see that with violence against protesters now in the US. How do we deal with a blank space that the lack of this media creates? So this question has been extremely relevant in these investigations, where the possibility of documentation is foreclosed, since by restricting physical and to a degree digital access to the river, it is impossible to study the river, and it is impossible, much less to study the border violence unfolding it, without employing a practice that is tailored to circumvent these restrictions. So the practice that we employ to partially circumvent these limitations is what we call situated testimony. It is an interviewing technique developed by forensic architecture over the course of the previous years, where witnesses reconstruct 3D models of the scenes and environments in which traumatic events have occurred, to aid in the process of interviewing and gathering testimony to those events. So memories of traumatic or violent episodes can often be elusive or distorted, but we have found that the use of digital architectural models has a productive effect on witness recollection. So in this case, 3D modeling and game engines were used to aid witness memory in reconstructing obscure detention spaces that they were taken to before they were pushed back, as well as other spaces that they found themselves in during the pushback. So I have a clip here below, but we cannot see it, but you can see it online on our Vimeo page, I believe, because we don't, it's an investigation which is in progress, so we're yet to publish the complete investigation. But this clip is a preview and shows how this methodology was employed with people. We interviewed people that had been pushed back And we, through these interviews, the people were also able to reconstruct from scratch detention centers, especially the Poros detention center, which is an obscure detention facility in Evros. That center is not really known as a detention center because it was built as a military facility, but was repurposed with the European Union funds in 2012. And although it operates officially as a border guard station to detain migrants when other sites are over capacity, with corroborating our testimonies with other sources, we found that in practice, the Poros facility operates as one of the main nodes of the illegal pushback infrastructure. So it is a deport center. It was actually called a deport center by a person we interviewed, where migrants are subjected to degrading and violent treatment before being pushed back across the river. So there are many testimonies of people being detained in that building, and there is very few information about the building itself and the center. And through our testimonies, we were able to understand more what is happening there. And also through our testimonies, we also try to develop further the technique that we use, the situated testimony, because in our case, we needed not only to construct architectural spaces, meaning a building or spaces that are easily constructed with typical architectural software, but we also wanted to reconstruct together with the people the scene of the pushback itself, because as I said, there is no information on what happens there. So for this, we used also other software, like game engine software, where it's usually with a custom-made digital tools. We were able to rapidly and easily model the natural landscape of the river and weather conditions as described by the witnesses. So throughout this project and its various manifestations, as I have presented it today, and I'm sorry, the material, you could not see it very well, we attempt to document the complexity of a heavily militarized and densely patrolled border, so the Evros Meritz River, which is patrolled, policed out of sight, and with no regard for human rights. So for this, we need to dissect images when these are publicly available, but also to create them when all other possibilities for documentation are foreclosed. Thank you.
Dimitra, thank you so much for your patience. And this was tricky for all of us. Trust me, we were very nervous with the technical difficulties. You managed perfectly, even without the videos. There were plenty of videos that you didn't see, but I recommend you all to also kind of dive deeper into the work of forensic architecture on their website. Almost everything is documented there. Again, thanks for your patience. And we are topically very well connected to the next speaker, just as Dimitra showed us how to make hidden histories visible, so does Elias. Another form of alternative archive of information, you could say. I, in the beginning, introduced Mitchell already briefly. Mitchell Esaias is one of the co-founders of the New Urban Collective and the Black Archives in Amsterdam. A platform and archive, a collective that questions dominant narratives within the European city from a post-colonial perspective, from a Suriname and Caribbean diaspora perspective. You already done 3 days of workshop here, and I'm super thrilled to have you. Thanks for coming. Stage is yours, and I hope the technical difficulties here will end.
Yes, thank you for the invitation, and well, thanks everybody for coming and for being so patient with all of the technical challenges. I know how it is sometimes when you have to organize something in a new venue at a new place. They think everything is perfectly organized, and all of a sudden the technical difficulties start to run. So let's hope mine will work. One thing is that I don't have videos, so if we can just connect it to a HDMI, we should be fine. And hopefully it will work if we switch it to the different screen. How's everybody feeling? Healthy and well? Good, good. Yeah, it's a strange time, no? With face mask and 1.5 meters and all these things. I'm glad we can still at least organize something. So, I'll wait till the screen is up and then I can start. Yeah, okay. No problem. Apparently, my laptop has to go that way as well. So, let's have a look. I'll start by introducing myself a little bit. My name is Mitchell, born and bred in Amsterdam. And yeah, my parents are from Suriname. Anybody been to Amsterdam before, maybe? No. Okay, for those who haven't, feel free to pass by when coronavirus is gone. Ah, there it is. Now let's hope the clicker works. Ah, perfect. So, I already started introducing myself. My name is Mitchell, born and bred in Amsterdam. And thanks for the invitation. I was asked to share some of our experiences at the Black Archives around making hidden history visible. So that's what I'm going to do. Over the past 3 days, 3 days, I had 3 hours to talk, and it wasn't even enough, so I'm going to try to do it in 30 minutes. I'll start by introducing myself. I come from quite a large family. They migrated to the Netherlands in the 1970s. My grandmother had 15 children, grandpa had 16. I have more than 50 cousins. And the reason I say that was because I was the first in my family to go to academic education. So, in the Dutch context, you first go to primary school, then to secondary school, and I was the first to go to the higher level of education, secondary school. So you can try to guess where I'm standing. See a few people look like, who is it? 50 odds. Okay. This little guy right here. A few years later, I was still there. And I think this time, it's a bit easier to identify me. That is because I was the only black guy in class. And that's not necessarily a problem. However, I noticed this because I went to a school with a lot of children from all kinds of backgrounds and colors and cultures. But in my class, in the academic level, it was often the case that I was the only black person. And I noticed that at the other levels, there was much more diversity. Another thing that I noticed was that in school we learn a lot about certain parts of history, such as the Second World War, the Enlightenment, and topics like that. But we did not learn much to anything about colonial history, which is also part of Dutch and European history. And I noticed this because I did learn about it in school. So I went on to the university, and I don't have a picture of that, but I hope that you believe me when I say that, I was in a class of 200 to 300 people, and again, I was the only, if not one of the few black students. So I started this collective together with a few friends called New Urban Collective, in which we try to bring together students with different cultural backgrounds. And we use the term urban because what we see in the city is that there are many people with different backgrounds and cultures living together in small spaces. So we started organizing all kinds of events like debates, youth exchanges to London around Black history, campaign called Decolonizing the University, a mentoring program where we mentor children from Amsterdam Southeast, the black neighborhood of Amsterdam. I'll tell a bit more about that later on. But I was asked to tell more about the Black Archives, so that's what I'm going to do now. We started with NUC, the Urban Collective, in 2011. A few years later, we were approached by these two guys, Chemo and Helmut. The father was Waldo Halberdon, and you may know this Halberdon is a German name. This because in the former colony Suriname, there were European plantation owners from different European countries, including from Germany, and the abolition of slavery, they actually gave their names to enslaved people. So we have a lot of German names in Suriname. But that's a side note. So Halberdon was a sociologist from Suriname who did a lot of research on plantation economies and slavery economies. Besides that, he also looked at how history is being written. And so one of the things he argued, and there are a lot of other scholars who also look critically at how history is being written, is that often the history is being presented as if there's one objective, neutral, national history. And the history which is part of the canon, part of the curriculum, school books, the history which we see in museums and cultural institutions, and is presented as if it's objective and neutral. However, what he argues, and a few other people argue it as well, is that it's not as neutral as people often claim. In fact, history can be seen as a reconstruction of the past, meaning that choices are made about which stories we tell, which people we put on a pedestal, which narratives we choose, which parts of history become included in the textbooks and in cultural institutions. And what you often see is that the dominant group within society also has the power to construct a historical narrative which suits their interests. And over the past decades or centuries, we could say that there have been mostly white heterosexual men, meaning that a lot of histories, narratives, perspectives from people who did not belong to the dominant class were either completely left out or marginalized in our dominant historical narratives. Still following? Nobody falling asleep? Okay, that's good. So he was very critical of that, and tried to look at history from different perspectives. Unfortunately, Halberdon passed away in 2009, and he left behind quite a large collection of books, about 3,000 books. So his sons inherited that, had it at home for quite a while in boxes, and after a while they were like, hey, let's do something with the collection. So they approached us, and together with them, we got the opportunity to use this small little room in Amsterdam North. And in relation to this exhibition about cities and living, it's good to say that this does not really exist anymore. Because we came there knowing that it would be temporary, because it was already planned to redevelop the whole area. Amsterdam North used to be a neighborhood with a lot of people from the lower socio-economic classes, but it has become highly gentrified. So a lot of people are being pushed out, and in between, what you see with gentrification is that people from the creative class are there, students are able to use the spaces for a little bit. So we were able to use it for a while, but we had to leave again after a few months. And when we look at Halberdon, he was critical about history, and he focused mostly on narration, historical perspectives. But there are other scholars who go even a step further, who argue that you can look critically at historical narratives. You can see post-colonial scholars looking critically at how history is being taught. But you can even go further when we write historical narratives, taught to use primary sources. You cannot just write a little story. You can do that, but the way we are taught at university or other educational institutions is that you need sources, you need references. But where do you go to find your sources? Where do you find your primary sources, especially? Usually at archives. And where do we go to archives? National archives, city archives, archives of companies, where you can find primary documents. However, what do you do when you go to archive and there are no sources, or there are only sources from a certain perspective? Then it becomes hard to look at it from another perspective. It may sound a little bit abstract, so let's give it a clear example. This is a scan, the most high quality I know is, but a scan of a document from the archive. It's a promissory note. Dutch abolished slavery in the West in Indian colonies in 1863. They were one of the last. The English did 1844, the French 1848, and the Dutch were one of the last. One of the reasons why it took so long was because there were plantation owners residing in Amsterdam. They had a lot of share and interest in plantations in the colonies. But they argued that if the Dutch state would abolish slavery, it would mean that they would take away their property. So they looked at the enslaved not as human beings, but literally as production tools, property. So they argued if the state takes away their property, then they have a right for compensation, because it was so unfair to them. And after a few years of debating, indeed the Dutch state said, okay, we'll compensate you. Suriname, they got 300 guilders per enslaved person. In Curaçao, the Dutch Caribbean island, 200 guilders. And in Sint Maarten, 250 guilders. So also a strange calculation. But what you can see through this document is that, first of all, the colonial and racialized logic of looking at people as products. And when you go into the National Archive, you'll find these documents. You'll find it's quite easy to find documents from the Dutch Parliament debating about how or when to abolish slavery. You'll find petitions from the plantation owners, all these documents. But when you want to know about the perspective of the enslaved, for example, it's almost impossible, quite hard, because they were not seen as human beings. Thus, they were not deemed as worthy enough to conserve or even document their perspectives, their thoughts, their visions. So the argues is that historical facts are not created equal. So what we try to do at the archive is collect the black perspectives for as far as possible. Going back to Helblond, we started in Amsterdam North, and we had to leave the space because of gentrification. So when we're looking for a different space, we ended up in this building, and this building is in Amsterdam East. It's one of the few black-owned buildings with a collective purpose in Amsterdam. And it's owned by the Association of Surinamese People, which is also one of the oldest associations of migrant people in the Netherlands. It was set up in 1919, so that's quite early. There were not that many Surinamese or other black people in the Netherlands around that time. And we heard they had some space. So we went there, didn't really know them, just heard they had some space. We were desperate for space, we didn't have much money, so this is where we ended up. As you can see, it was quite messy, very dusty, not really organized. So we made a deal. So we said, hey, we can help you clean up, if we can put our books there. We have to be honest, I thought, we'll just throw everything out and we have a lot of space. However, while cleaning up, we found out that there was a lot of interesting material hidden in the boxes. I'm going to show a few examples which we found through what we call community archiving. We found these pamphlets, magazines from the 1960s, old newspapers, the New York Times from the 1950s about the civil rights movement. We found these beautiful examples, Ebony magazine with Martin Luther King on the cover, Time magazine with James Baldwin. One of my favorites is this booklet with personal notes from Langston Hughes, one of the well-known poets from the Harlem Renaissance in New York. First edition of Malcolm X autobiography. So fascinating documents. Also some things from closer to home like this. A pamphlet about Kitty Kotti, the abolishment of slavery, which takes place in 1863. But to us it was a surprise that this pamphlet was from an event organized in 1951. And around that time, again, there were not that many black people. So to us it was like we found a hidden history. We also found some things from a more recent period, and Dimitri, thank you for beautiful presentations. You already briefly mentioned that Black Lives Matter, police violence. And what you often see in the Dutch context, maybe also in Germany, is that people argue that issues of race, racism, it's not really an issue anymore. It's something that happens in the United States, maybe South Africa, but here, not really. That's what we heard this summer as well, when people were protesting in solidarity with the United States, under Black Lives Matter. But what we found were documents. This says it appears to be a ritual to abuse Surinamese people. Yeah, this one, I guess, speaks for itself. I don't have to talk too much about it. It shows the result of police violence in the 1970s. So it shows that this has been a big problem in the church context as well. But we also found things like these, pictures of people protesting, marching, organizing, performing, and when you look at this picture, there are a lot of interesting elements which you can dissect, like this Black Panther. We found out that there was a Surinamese or a black movement in Amsterdam inspired by the Black Panther movement in the US. A picture of a Surinamese anti-colonial fighter. This was his mother. So all of a sudden we found all of these fascinating histories. And that was so fascinating because, as I said, in the Dutch context, you often are confronted with this narrative that, you know, it's not that bad. There's an anthropologist called Gloria Becker. She wrote a book, White Innocence. And in the book, she argues that you have this paradox. Because on the one hand, you have a very dominant narrative in the Dutch context where people say, like, hey, you know, it's the most, or one of the most open and tolerant and equal countries in the world, where you can go to the coffee shop, not just for a cup of coffee, if you know what I mean. You can, you have all kinds of liberal laws around soft drugs and sex work and LGBTQ plus rights, so there's some truth in it. But at the same time, the Dutch have been one of the major imperial powers for 300 to 400 years, organizing, colonizing large parts of the world based on all kinds of racialized theories. And of course, that left behind traces in current present-day society. But when people try to mention or address these legacies in the form of racism or discrimination, people are met with a lot of anger or denial or disavowal. So this paradox is what she calls white innocence. And what we try to do is show other perspectives, other sides of the stories, which show that this part of history and its legacy in present-day society should be acknowledged and addressed as well. And the way we try to do that is by cooperating with artists, because we have quite some amazing archival documents and books, and through these documents, we do a lot of archival research, look for oral history, and yeah, we found some fascinating stories. One example, I won't go into deep to that today, but one of the fascinating stories we found was the story of Otto and Hermie Huiswoud. Otto was born in Suriname, Hermie in Guyana. At a young age, they ended up in New York. He became the only black co-founder of the Communist Party in the United States. From that position, traveled all around the world, to Hamburg, Germany, South Africa, Brussels, Paris, you name it. And after the Second World War, they ended up in Amsterdam at this association. So we have a part of their collection. But it's a fascinating story. However, most people have never heard about it. So we made this exhibition together with a few artists to, you know, make it visible and also make it accessible for a broad audience and not just a few historians, archivists, and academics. Yeah, highlight was when Angela Davis visited us. That was, of course, very nice. So based on that first exhibition, we were like, hey, you know, there are so many more stories and documents behind, so many more stories behind the documents and the pictures. So what we did is that we, created a space where we could invite people, especially from the older generation, to help us identify the stories behind the documents and pictures. This is one example. It's taken in 1988, the year that I was born, in the building where we are located now. Picture of Otto Huiswoud, Anton de Kom, and this lady is still alive. And so we found this picture and we were able to interview her, engage with her several times, and based on that we gathered more information. And based on all the information that we found through the research and the oral history, we developed a new exhibition which is currently open for view in Amsterdam. These are a few snapshots of it. Found some artists. Yeah, another beautiful picture. This was the first Kitty Kotti, Emancipation of Slavery March in Amsterdam. And it's quite fascinating to us because when we think about these topics, a lot of people think that it started recently. Nowadays, you see more and more that it's becoming part of the collective memory. There are public monuments and events. It started about 20 years ago. But apparently, people had been organizing marching since decades ago. So that's what we try to show, that there's a much longer history and presence in both the city and even broader in the Netherlands. Another example. Let me know when I've still 10 minutes or something. You know, can talk a lot. Another example. I thought I'd share this one because this exhibition is about cities and all kinds of developments in the cities. As I said, we came in this building, started to unpack boxes and found all kinds of documents. And I'm sorry that I didn't get to translate, but I'll summarize this for you. What's more important is that you see this. So this was one of the documents that we found, and it really stood out because of the cartoon on the front page. It says apartheid, only access for people of Dutch descent, black book, closed neighborhoods. So we're like, what is this about? Is it about South Africa, apartheid? We didn't know. So we started to look into it and found out that it was not about South Africa. In fact, it was about what was happening in Amsterdam and other cities in the Netherlands in the 1970s. Because in the 1970s, there was a large wave of migration from the former colonies, especially from Suriname, later on the Dutch Caribbean. In the late 60s, you had large numbers of people were recruited as so-called migrant or guest laborers, especially from Turkey and Morocco, to work in the factories. And as I said, you have this dominant narrative of Amsterdam, open, tolerant, open for everybody, liberal, etc. But what we found here was that it was not as open and tolerant as is being claimed. In fact, this is a copy of a newspaper article in this document saying that there was a fear for black neighborhoods. So apparently people are like, hey, they can come, but we don't want too many of them in our neighborhood. So apparently, this is what this says. There were actual policies in place in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, saying that they wanted a maximum amount of or a maximum percentage of people with a migrant background, because they didn't want too many black people in the neighborhood. So, for example, in Rotterdam, there was the so-called 5% policy, a maximum of 5% people with a migrant background. Otherwise, you could be, banned from the neighborhood, solely based on your color or your cultural background. This is a non-high quality scan of some of the neighborhoods where black people and people of color were not welcomed. This is one part of the story. Then we have a second part of the story which we found via this document. This document was is a newspaper from the association from the 1970s. And as you can see, the title is the Actie in de Bijlmer, the action in de Bijlmer. What is the Bijlmer? The Bijlmer is like the black neighborhood of Amsterdam, where there's more than 70% people with Surinamese, Caribbean, African backgrounds. And it's a neighborhood which has a very interesting history. I'll give the short version. So what you can read here is the story of this lady. And you can see it's a picture of her with the mayor of back then, Amsterdam, and people in the background holding protest signs. And so on the one hand, you had the policy that black people and people of color were not welcome in certain parts of the neighborhood. On the other hand, there was another policy, the so-called spreading policy, where they said, hey, we want to spread these people across the country so they don't, cluster too much and concentrate too much. We don't want that. Another part of the policy was that they placed people in social or in pensions, in boarding houses, privately owned boarding houses, and the owners of the boarding houses got subsidized per person per day that they stayed. So unfortunately, there were a lot of people, owners of these boarding houses, who kind of abused the situation by pushing as many people in these, in these houses in which the conditions were very, very bad, to make as much money as possible. So she describes the situation where there's no shower, no toilets, very dirty with cockroaches everywhere and things like that. And again, we found these documents and we had no clue that this had ever happened. And there were hundreds of people who had experienced this. Then we come to the third part of the story, which is the Bijlmer. Because nowadays the Bijlmer is known as the so-called black neighborhood, which is also stigmatized and stereotyped as like quote-unquote ghetto of Amsterdam. But around that time in the 1960s, the Bijlmer, and this is a picture of what it used to look like, was developed as a very new, innovative, modern urban development project based on all kinds of architectural and modernistic theories and vision of a lot of green space, large rise building projects with spacey rooms, and the traffic for living was separated for the traffic for going to work. So it was developed in this very idealistic, or based on a very idealistic vision in the late 60s. However, there were some problems in terms of financing. It was a bit disconnected from the rest of the city. The public facilities were not developed enough, and it was quite expensive. So there was a lot of empty housing. So you have the closed neighborhoods policy, you have the boarding house policy, people migrating to the Netherlands, and at the same time you have empty housing. So what happened is that different action groups came together. Back then there was a large squatting movement in the Netherlands, especially in Amsterdam. You can actually see it in one of the works in the exhibition. So these action groups came together and said, hey, we also have a right, or these people, these migrant people also have a right for, decent living, to live in a decent place. So they started squatting buildings, squatted some of these flats. And it's only then that the number of people with a migrant background started to rise in this neighborhood. They even made a song called the Bijlmer Kraak song. It's like very enthusiastic, which is we found in the archives as well. And to give a little fun anecdote, my partner, 5 minutes, my partner is born and bred in the Bijlmer. Her mother still lives in one of these flats, Gravenstein. So we were, of course, very, enthusiastic that we found out about the story, and we're like, hey, did you know about this? You found out that people squatted buildings, this, that. And she's like, yeah, of course I know. But she had never told us. And she was like, yeah, I was there. Everybody did it. So it was a very interesting example of how, there are people who are still alive who have actually experienced these moments, these historical moments, which to us looking back are, very important moments in history, because you could say that people claimed their space in the city, and the neighborhood is now really a distinctive neighborhood with its own subculture. But a lot of people, even people who grew up there, have no clue about this history. So this became part of our exhibition as well, and we're trying to make it more visible through our work. So these are a few pictures that we found, the solidarity protest with the squatting movement. And a lot of these people are still alive, so that's nice. I think I will skip the story of Anton de Kom because of time. No, I'll end with that. So what I'm trying to show is how through archival research, both in our own archive and other archives, collecting oral histories, we try to make these stories visible, which can contribute to people, feeling, to people's sense of belonging in the city. Because if you grow up in the city and all you learn about and read about is, you know, how white people, European people, Dutch people, white Dutch people contributed to history, as if Surinamese or black people or migrant people didn't contribute anything. You know, it may contribute to a feeling that, you know, you're a guest. But this history shows that, you know, we have not been guests. We've been here for quite a long time. And we contributed a lot to the development of the city, to the culture of the city, to the culture of the whole country, you could say. And so that's one of the reasons why we think it's essential to tell these stories. Now, Anton de Kom, to wrap it up. Just like Otto Hasselt, born in Suriname, 1898, but at a young age he moved to the Netherlands, first generation born after slavery. In the Netherlands he got in touch with all kinds of political activists, communists, Indonesian nationalists, etc. And his heart was still in Suriname, so we went back. Because slavery had been abolished, but obviously the conditions were not much better. People were recruited from Indonesia, China, and India to take over the work of the formerly enslaved, and basically had to work in similar kinds of conditions. So he tried to help them, you know, claim their rights, and because of that he was seen as a threat to the colonial order. So he started to mobilize them, organize them, became very popular, and because of that he was seen as a threat, got arrested and deported to the Netherlands in the 1930s. In the Netherlands he wrote this book called We Slaves of Suriname. Ironic because slavery was already over, but argued that the situation was not much better. And this is the picture where you see a lot of his following, the house where he lives now. And he wrote this book. When the Second World War broke out, Dutch were occupied by the Nazis. He joined the resistance against the Nazis and unfortunately died in one of the concentration camps in Neuengamme. So again, fascinating story, ties and intersect with all kinds of histories from the Second World War to Dutch colonialism, literature, but very unknown in the Dutch context. So Surinamese people, most Surinamese people know about it, but for the rest, it's quite erased and silenced. And what we found in the archives was this, the movement, who had also been part of the squatting movement, had found out about Anton de Kom, made illegal copies of his book in the 1970s, even set up a petition to, you know, honor him, which led to a square in Amsterdam Southeast named after him in the 1990s. This is one of the ladies who's still alive and shared a lot of these stories. Yeah, they organized conferences, wrote publications, and this is a statue of him currently in Amsterdam Southeast. This is a few weeks ago, one of the biggest Black Lives Matter protests, one of the biggest anti-racist protests ever in Dutch history, was planned on the square named after him, but it was, the number of people who wanted to come was so big that we had to move it to the Nelson Mandela Park, which is around the corner. So what it shows is that the current anti-racist movement, and I don't have time to talk too much about that today, but there's a very interesting movement going on now against Zwarte Piet. It's part of a much longer history of black presence, of black emancipation movements in the Dutch context. And gladly enough, we have got some good news this summer, that Anton de Kom will become part of the canon, so the curriculum, the school books, so all Dutch children have to learn about him. A new edition of his book was published, and it became part of the bestseller list. So this summer, and I'm going to wrap it up with that, we opened up a new space in Amsterdam Southeast, the Black Argus Belmer, where we can make some space for this humongous donation to make this history visible for people in Amsterdam Southeast. So I think I'm gonna wrap it up there. Thank you for listening. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and
Thank you. Thanks to both of you. Both of you are allowed to take off the masks, and me too while I'm here. This is a moment where we would like to ask you if you have any questions, either addressed to Dimitra or Mitch or both of them. Don't feel shy. There's no such thing as a stupid question, I always say. Should I break the ice by asking the first question? I will. Okay, so first of all, I would like to applaud both of you to your work. This is also very daring work in both cases. Fits very well to our intention here in the exhibition about creating narratives within the urban context. These are highly political narratives that you're creating, narratives that are challenging a prominent, a dominant narrative and cultural memory, as you said. What both of you have in common is that you work very investigative. It's basically research and the creation of narration. Now, in this work, what are your biggest challenges? Because I can imagine there are many, from a practical matter and a day-to-day experience.
First, thank you for the talk. It was really great to learn more about your work. The biggest challenge, we have many challenges for sure. I think I would say that one of the biggest challenges that we face is that many times our work is not taken seriously enough because it's considered art. And in art exhibitions, it's not considered art, it's considered politics or something else. So I think this kind of like intersection that our work is found within, because we didn't talk about this more, well before, but we operate in many different forms. So we operate in cultural institutions, we operate in media, and we operate also in court cases. So all these different forums are really, really in contradiction with each other many times. And we found ourselves on the crossroads between those forums. And we think it's really crucial that we are able to operate in all of them at the same time. And I think the challenge is, for example, law has such a it's very much entrenched within, I mean, of course, also colonial systems of a view from nowhere, of an objectivity, where everything that dissects even slightly from that forum is considered not admissible or partial or not enough in order to make a claim, right? So in that case, many times our work may be dismissed as artistic work. So, okay, these are a bunch of artists, what can they say to us about this, right? Whereas there is also a huge kind of like debate whether we are supposed to even be presenting our work in artist institutions if we're not artists. So I think the challenge is, I mean, I don't know if I explained it very well, but I think this is the kind of like intersection, interdisciplinarity of our work is also what put us in challenges many times.
I think our challenges are partly similar. We're also kind of operating on the intersections of art, activism / politics, education, research. But we don't fit in like one box. So for a lot of people who are used to like work in one particular sector on box, they're like, hey, oh, that's interesting, but you notice that it's difficult for them to understand. So in our opinion, we do try to also always work, based on quality work with artists who, make amazing work. Our research is, in my opinion, very good, very well. But it's often kind of played down as like, oh, these activists, these black activists, instead of looking at the content. So that is one of the challenges, but yeah, we don't want to depend on the opinions of others, and we do see some, changes in the cultural sector in Amsterdam and the Netherlands, where you see that the dominant institutions are also starting to address these kinds of issues. The second challenge, I think, especially for the past few years, have been resources. We really started as a grassroots organization, for a student organization, and we kind of organically grew into an archive and cultural center. So yeah, most of the work has been done on a voluntary basis, without like huge funding or whatever. So yeah, that was a lot of unpaid labor, emotional labor, intellectual labor. But the good news is that we did become part of the Amsterdam Cultural Plan for the next 4 years, so we will get funding in the future, which is nice. Third challenge is the violent reactions, and that is mostly targeted towards the activistic work. But yeah, the problem is, we are persons. Yes? On the one hand, we're part of the grassroots anti-racist movement, but we're also, researchers and archivists. But especially from that side of, our activist work, we are, unfortunately, often confronted with verbal, digital, sometimes even physical violence. So that is a big risk, challenge, but, as Frederick Douglass said, there's no progress without struggle. So, we're just trying to be careful, and we're making progress.
There's a question from the audience.
Hey, thank you for your great talks and much needed work. I have a question for Dimitra. I was wondering, when you were talking about the event in March, and you said that you basically, I don't know, maybe you got to know about these events through social media, right? I don't know if that is right. So how do you actually decide on which case or which situation you want to put your joint effort into? So I don't know. You said there are so many images and so many stuff going on social media. How do you select? How do you say, this is the moment that we kick off and mobilize your network to dive into it?
So yes, for that specific case, we had already been working on that border area. So of course, since we had already been doing work, we were actively doing work at that time when things escalated so much, because things really escalated towards the end of February. We knew we kind of had to intervene in some way. Like we felt that it is not really possible to continue doing what we're doing on that border area when things are changing so rapidly. So in that specific case, it was something that we were anyway involved in. We were anyway in contact with people on the ground, and we also have one of our researchers is permanently based in Greece, and so he's one of our main kind of key actors, connecting with networks, etc. So in that specific case, it kind of came naturally that seeing this and doing the work that we're doing on this area, it's really imperative that we try to intervene in some way in that political moment. Other cases, yes, most of the time, I think many times it comes through a network of, or a commission it may come, so people, lawyers of the victims or of the families of the victims. So if we're talking about larger kind of projects, it can be also in collaboration with other human rights groups. It's the selection of case really depends also on what is the importance of that case in order to stimulate change, or in order to mobilize some change. So how can we, from that specific event, infer and go back to a larger structure that facilitates this event? So that this is really kind of crucial for us in selecting the cases that we work on.
Hi, Thank you both. Oh, sorry, I'm not meant to. This is Corona limitations. I'm Caroline, and I really enjoyed both of the talks. Thank you. I have a question or a comment. It could be a comment, it could become a question. You both have spoken about how your practices sit at the intersection, and therefore, is it art, is it research, is it architecture? Where is the forum for this? And this, and yet my observation has been in maybe over the last 10 years, these intersectional practices have become they're the main game. You know, like if you think of Documenta 2017, it was almost all historical archives and these kind of situated, going back and unearthing prior histories, or engaging, socially engaged design, socially engaged art, urban interventions, temporary, you know, this intersection between art, design, research, and activism and politics. In that, do you have a sense that this is do you feel really marginalized in this practice now, or do you have the same sort of perspective on this, or is it just where I'm looking from, where it seems that this is the main game at the moment, this intersectional, and also for me the most interesting area? Oh, I just want to add one more thing on that. Sorry. If you look, for example, at the many of the residencies and other opportunities that are open for artists and researchers, they're all, so many of them around the world are targeted at basically contributing to a better future, social sort of, there is this call for engagement all round. Any comments?
Yeah, thanks for the interesting question. Do we feel marginalized? Yeah, there's also a question about feeling. I think when you look at the broader structures within society, and of course I can speak best from the Dutch context, the work that we do is unfortunately marginalized, in the sense that the core of our work, we did not start out with the idea of, oh, let's start the archive. The main reason of existence is because we think that within dominant historical narratives in education, these perspectives are marginalized, and that, to me, is a fact. So we operate on this intersection of indeed art, politics, activism, and what I found interesting is that within this, especially within the arts, there is indeed some space to, address these issues, to make it visible, to cooperate with artists and be part of artistic projects. But that is not our main aim. That's not our main goal. It's not our goal to develop a nice exhibition. Our goal is to actually combat the racist structure within society. So in that sense, I do think it's still marginalized, because the structures that reproduce the inequalities that we originally tried to address within education, when you talk about police violence, all these manifestations of white supremacy, and institutional racism, those are still in place. So indeed, there are some spaces and pockets within society, especially within the artistic field, where we are being recognized and we do have the space to do our work. But when we look outside of that sector, and sometimes it's also kind of a bubble, there's still a lot of work to be done, and still on the marginalized side.
Yes, I would just want to add that what I find interesting in our perspective is that there are many civil society groups lately that actually also work on trying themselves to to form a narrative to counter state violence or corporate violence. So this is what we're seeing an increasingly kind of like growing amount of human rights groups, but also open source investigators that really operate independently, operate in small groups, etc., and work on the intersection, let's say, of journalism, open source investigation, less on the art scene, but yes. So of course, I think there has been this kind of like growing attention to research and art and politics for many years, I would say. So in that sense, forensic architecture specifically is not alone in that discipline. There are many other groups that are doing the same and many other individuals that are doing the same. But I think the kind of like visibility that this has taken probably is able to prompt more visibly in return kind of like presentations, manifestations of that in other forums.
Hello, thank you both for the work that you're doing. My question is for Mitchell. It's a very simple question. So I'm very new to this archival work, and I couldn't attend the workshop. But I would be very interested if you know about similar initiatives in Berlin or in Germany that have a similar approach similar to the way that you're working. And a very specific question would be if you also do archival work with music or musical content.
Okay. Yeah, try to click. Oh, this was my bad.
And
so to address the first question, as you can see, I have way too many slides as always. Skipped quite a lot. But to get to the first question, is there a similar initiative in Berlin? Yes. I'm not sure if they were there. I did invite somebody, but you have Each One Teach One, EYOTO. They kind of run a similar initiative trying to document histories of people of African descent in the German context. I do think they are less active on the intersection of history, archiving, and art. They're more focused on history, archiving, and public events. But we do see them as a brother or sister or fellow kind of organization. Sorry, what was the second part of the question again?
About music, and if you also have material about music. And another thing would be if it would be possible to have some documentation on the workshop that took part, but maybe that's something more for the curation team.
Yeah, I think indeed for the curation team. But in terms of music, absolutely. What I know this, and as I said, we're not professionally trained archivists, but we kind of organically grew into this. And traditionally, when you look at like European archives, it's mostly documents which were being conserved and seen as legitimate archival documents or artifacts. Also in MUSEA, specific objects. But when you look at especially Black or African histories and culture, music and sound plays a very important role. So we definitely try to include that as well, both from traditional older forms of music and culture, and certainly with Wintis, like an Afro-spiritual culture where music plays a very important role, to present-day things like hip-hop. So often we ask hip-hop and spoken word artists to create something based on the archive, and in that way we also try to make it more accessible for all kinds of people.
Maybe one last question from the audience.
Hi, thanks very much. My question is also for Mitch. I guess looking back from perhaps 10 years from now, how would you see the Black archives treating contemporary events that are happening now? The end of your presentation, for example, touched upon Black Lives Matter. Yeah. So would that also be something within the scope? And if so, how do you see the Black archives treating those events at the moment?
Oh, that's a beautiful question, because then we can imagine a little bit. But hopefully in 10 years, I hope that a lot of the work that we're literally struggling for become part of, you know, the mainstream. It should be normalized that we look at histories and culture from different perspectives. And hopefully that can contribute to, you know, more social justice in society, not just in the Netherlands, but worldwide. We really believe that education is fundamental. A lot of this inequality and racism comes from ignorance. So yeah, we hope that the more it becomes part of our collective consciousness and knowledge, the more we can, you know, work towards a equal society. And a good thing, for example, the Black Pete tradition is almost, and yesterday we got the news in The Hague, it's already abolished. In all the big cities been abolished, so hopefully after 10 years we don't have to go into the streets again anymore for that. And in terms of institution, I hope that we can grow and develop more creative ways, which can be included in all educational institutions from primary school to higher education, and we can continue to do, you know, amazing work on the intersections of art, education, research, maybe together with you. So yeah, I think those are some of the things that we are thinking about. Thanks for the question.
Then I join the stage with you. So on behalf of the curatorial team, we would like to thank you all for being here. We would like to thank you too for giving such inspirational talks, and thank you for being here. Please mingle, stay around. We're open still another hour every Thursday, so there's beers and drinks in the Airlift Cafe. There's actually a bookstore from Schöneberg, Books, People and Places, that took over the little kiosk in the front with a beautiful selection of books on the subject or the intersection of art and urbanism, architecture, etc., in both theory and practice. That's also only every Thursday evening. As I said, again, also on behalf of all of us, sorry for these technical difficulties. This week everything is the first time, so next week it's going to be all smooth sailing. Dimitra, thanks for your patience. This was really a rough one for you, a rough ride, but you did it fantastically. Mitch, thanks so much for this whole week. Next week, Thursday, I hope to see you again here, 7 o'clock. We have as guests Emeka Okereke and Akimbode Akimbi, two Nigerian photographers and artists that are based both in Berlin and in Lagos. And they're going to speak about their work as photographers documenting urban space. There will also be a screening by Emeka about the work of Akimbode. So yeah, thanks again for being here. Warm applause to our speakers.